All right, welcome back, and thanks for bearing with us yet again. I would like to introduce Dr. Jess Rowan Marcotte, who is our keynote speaker today. Jess is a designer, writer, and maker working in the junction of interactive games, game design, and digital technologies. They are a queer mixed, Mi'kmaq, and white European settler creator from a lower middle class background living with chronic pain and health conditions. They are one of the co-founders of Soft Chaos Cooperative and help lead the queerness and games conferences. They design interactive experiences, including digital games, toys, LARPs, theatrical experiences, tabletop role-playing games, installations, alternative controllers, and hybrid game work. What unifies their design work is a general focus on queer, intersectional, feminist themes and design approaches, as well as explorations of awkwardness, vulnerability, and intimacy. Jess will be speaking on designing queerly and designing while queer now. Queer desires and experiences are misfits in a medium that, despite the evidence of a hunger for diverse voices and experiences on the part of players, continues to generally be marketed towards white, straight, cisgender male gamers. This is a productive friction and attention of queer bodies and experiences at play in work of queer game designers. These forces have led to a number of design practices that are at odds with game design best practices and status quo. And Jess will tell us more about that now.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. Going to be maybe a little bit seat of the pantsy because tech is tech, and it doesn't always love to work the way that it's supposed to. So with that lovely introduction, I can actually skip right past this part that is not working. So I can skip right past this pretty quickly. So like Melissa said, I'm a researcher, designer, and writer, performer, maker, and community organizer. Thank you. But anyway, I'm going to give you an overview of what I'm going to talk about today. So first, I'll lead you through some definitions related to queer game design, because I'm not sure the level of familiarity with it, especially on queerness and what it means to design queerly. Then I'll talk about some of the questions that this kind of definitional work brings up, and then I'll share some examples of queer games by other designers, as well as some of my own work. And then I'll use those examples to talk about common design patterns that I see in queer games. And afterwards, I will open it up to your questions. So what do we mean when we say queer game design, and what is queerness? So briefly in this talk, when I say game design, I mean the design of playful experiences that center players or an audience that is heavily participating or constructing the experience that they're taking part in. So playful experiences where people who aren't the creators get to do things. And there's a big range here. So there are lots of big blockbuster games, but there are also lots of smaller experiences that are more like indie art films or small plays. Think like the difference between a big production of like a Broadway musical or a Shakespeare play that has all the support in the world versus something made on a shoestring budget by a tiny theater company. So what do we mean when we say queer game design? Probably the most important part of this is to ask a different question. What is queerness, and what does it mean for something to be queer? So for the first part, pinning down what queerness is, that's very complicated. I'm sure you've heard a lot about that today. So briefly, two common everyday meanings of the word are either something that is weird or strange, or something that's related to LGBTQ people, like a queer person or a queer flag. And these days, I'd argue that those two meanings are tied together and call each other to mind. So queer identity really contains multitudes. For example, this might be a bit 101 for this audience, I'm not sure, but in addition to same-sex desire, there are people who don't experience attraction in the way that heteronormative identities expect. Maybe they don't experience sexual attraction at all, or maybe they only experience sexual attraction for people that they have a romantic feeling for, or maybe romantic feelings, but not sexual feelings, or vice versa. So those would all be examples from the asexual spectrum. And then there are also people who are attracted to two or more genders, but who may appear to be straight or straight passing when they're in a relationship that looks straight. So many bisexual and pansexual people experience this kind of queer invisibility. And then there are people like me who are transgender, but who don't fit a narrative of wanting to move from one binary gender to another. Rather than being a trans man or a trans woman, people like me often use terms for ourselves like non-binary, genderqueer, or gender fluid. So what queerness does very nicely is stand in for a lot of complex feelings and identities in a flexible way. So this quote is basically how I understand queerness. It's very fundamental to the way that I understand it. So the definitional indeterminacy of queerness and its elasticity and its like resistance to being defined is one of its constituent characteristics. The difficulty and the flexibility is part of this. Sarah Ahmed, on the other hand, points out that the Greek root of the word comes from cross, oblique, or adverse, and argues that preserving both senses of the word queer as a way of describing what's oblique or offline and stuck in describing specific sexual practices is very important. So specific sexualities are describable as queer in the first place because they're seen as odd, bent, or twisted. And similarly to Jagos, Ahmed notes the importance of the flexibility of the term as it moves across different registers. So without reducing or flattening these different experiences to a single line. Bo Ruberg tells us that being queer is about being different and desiring differently. So queerness is, it shifts over time. I think of queerness in line with these thinkers as being about our desires for our own bodies and for the bodies of others. And crucially, I think there's a kind of messiness or unsettledness to it. Queerness shifts and evolves in response to the status quo around it, and what's considered queer or offsides or oblique will change over time. And as for the queer design ethos, these things go way beyond just queer representation and queer characters in games, though it can certainly look like that. That's part of it. Personally, I come from a tradition of critical and reflective design practices, and a lot of the ways that I think about queer design align with those practices, around questioning and pushing back against the way things are in favor of how they could be instead. And queerness can be about exploring current experiences or about imagining a different future, or it can be about the weirdness and strangeness of queer existence within a heteronormative culture, or any other number of topics. Queer design is fundamentally at odds with the status quo, however designers choose to deal with that position. And lastly, queerness can and should include intersectionality as a core concern. We don't leave other parts of ourselves at the door when it comes to our experience of queerness. For example, as I mentioned before, I'm queer in Mi'kmaq, which is a people indigenous to Canada. I'm also white passing, and I experience chronic pain all at the same time. I experience those things as a whole person. And our struggles against the status quo of design and our systemic struggles are connected to our other identities and experiences. So some questions that this raises around definitions. First of all, is everything that a queer person makes queer? Do you have to be queer to make queer things? Is nothing queer? Is everything queer? Or how can we avoid emptying out the term of practical meaning without gatekeeping for identity and leaving that door open for folks that are still figuring things out? So is everything that a queer person makes queer? Sorry, bear with me with these notes, please. That's a good question. If queerness is about being oblique or questioning or pushing back against the status quo, then no, not everything a queer person makes is automatically queer. Queer people and LGBTQ folk are just as capable of reproducing or reinscribing those existing norms in that status quo as anyone else. At the same time, queerness doesn't necessarily need to relate directly to sexuality or gender and the representation of those things in a game. In that sense, queerness and desiring differently for our bodies and the bodies of others is about a perspective informed by queer lived experience. It's a way of seeing and a way of using one's way of being in the world to inform design decisions. So queer game design uses queer experiences to make games that question, undermine, or look different from the status quo. You have to be queer to make queer things. And this is where some of the complexity of queer identity comes in. So unfortunately, I mentioned asexuality and bisexuality, transness before as some specific forms of queerness. Unfortunately, some people are made to feel that they're not queer enough. And what I mean by that is that people are either told outright that their experience of queerness is not valid, or that experience is erased, like for bisexual people in a straight passing relationship. And there are also cases where transgender people will feel that they're, for example, not dysphoric enough, or they don't experience enough feelings about their gender to qualify them as trans. Some people might have queer feelings or experiences and they're not yet out, or they've not yet decided what those feelings mean to them. They might be using one label now, but they have questions or feelings that are not strictly in line with being heterosexual or cisgender. And the queer community has to leave that door open to people to explore their identity and create spaces to explore those feelings. Also, anyone could find themselves working with queer creators on a queer project, even if they themselves are not queer. I think like the important thing to note here is that if you are going to have queer content and you yourself don't consider yourself queer, then hiring a queer person to help with the project, at the very least, at the very minimum, as a consultant, is hugely important there. So is nothing queer? Is everything queer? How can we avoid emptying the term queer or queer game design of that practical meaning while avoiding that gatekeeping that we talked about? So my working definition has two parts. Do the creators say that the work is queer? If they do, it's queer. No other questions are needed about whether or not it counts. And second, does this work embody the notion of desiring differently for ourselves and others? And is it standing at an angle to, or oblique to, or adverse to the status quo of game design? Does it in some way question that status quo from queer positionality, or is it informed by queer experiences? If the answer to any of those questions is yes, then we've got a queer game. And that second question is especially important. Bringing difference to design, being out of line with that status quo, that culture, is crucial. We have to be alert to, as Kara Stone describes it, not reinscribing heteronormativity. So Stone says that she's hesitant to divorce queerness from the sexual and the gendered and move it to something broad, like I've been talking about as the non-normative. That at the same time as wanting to make queerness indestructible by embedding it into everything that she does, it's important to her that she doesn't suggest that just because she is queer, that everything she does is queer, or that her whole practice is always going to be queer. Because we have to sort of be conscious about what we're reinscribing and what we're encouraging and reinforcing about the status quo. And again, this is a shifting spectrum. So what's considered normal changes, what's considered the status quo changes all the time. So the goalposts of what it means to be queerly oblique and bring difference to our design will also shift and change. So queer game design is often defined in opposition to, and this kind of design involves the messiness of bodies and desires. It involves being at odds with a world that often actively seems to want to harm and silence queer designers, to want to make us more neat and seemly, and in some way easier or more palatable to a normative audience. When queer people take up space and make work that speaks to them or expresses that queer part of them, that's queer game design. So here are a few examples from work by myself and other queer designers that can show us some of those characteristics of queer game design. I might run into some trouble with my notes here because they're a bit longer. And scrolling on here is making the computer unhappy. So first, Toto Lin's Tiny Rainbow Rebels. This is how this game starts. You've won. The rich are shaking in their shambles, then poof, they're gone. You gaze in awe, eyes shining, wet with tears at your friends. You've made it, finally, and it's time to celebrate. You are a tiny frog in a leather jacket vest. You think it makes you look cool, and you would be correct. And all the blazing of a million suns couldn't stop you from relaxing and laughing in victory with your friends, hand in hand. So, although the characters in Tiny Rainbow Rebels are small and adorable, they're not weak or incapable. The blazing of a million suns cannot stop them, and neither could the rich capitalists. Theories of queer temporality and queer futurity after Munoz and others are also key influences to the themes of queer games. So here's a quote from Toto Lin's artist statement. So Lin says that their game expresses an ideal queer future past representation. I want it to allow players to step into a vision of a better world that we could create together, one where rest, health, community, and expression are valued, and there's an abundance of food and goods shared amongst everyone. This is my vision of a queer utopia, as Jose Esteban Munoz calls it. Lin's game is also made in Twine, which is a software with a very low barrier to entry, which makes it a very popular choice for designers who might not have formal training in programming or design, and hence a very popular choice for games. So Tiny Rainbow Rebels reclaims and reframes softness and cuteness as strengths in a world that wants us to be hard and grow a thick skin. The game is an example of something that's radically soft. It's cute and aesthetically very sweet and wholesome, but it has an edge to it. It's a game about imagining a different future where queerness and equity abounds. And this idea of radical softness comes from Laura Mathis, and it's a pretty common theme for queer games. So Gay Monster Kiss Club by Ryan Rosacea features non-humans, anthropomorphization like in Tiny Rainbow Rebels, and even queer monstrosity. So queer monstrosity is also a very big and common theme for queer people representing themselves. Monstrosity and queerness is especially interesting and complex subject to dig into. I think we'll have to save most of it for another day. But for now, what I'll say is that games like Gay Monster Kiss Club reflect how these queer creators and other queer people sometimes identify with monsters and the idea of the monstrous of uncomfortable desires. So queer people experience desires that others have historically and even now called monstrous or evil. So in an act of reclamation, these creators, faced with their humanity being questioned, with their desires being framed as perversions and monsters by those who hate us, make the monstrous a site of desire and romance. Essentially, Aisha and other queer people are saying, you view us as monsters? Great. We'll identify with monsters then. We will make the monsters lovable and desirable. So in that context, those alterations or desires for our bodies is another way that queer people can be identified with or identify with monstrosity. So to be clear, this is something that queer people might claim for themselves rather than something that should be ascribed to them, but it explains a design decision that you might see pretty often in queer games around monsters and monstrosity. Pillow Talk is a game that juxtaposes the act of conquering territory or capturing zones with the act of talking about the potentially pretty intimate topic of one's current, one assumes, romantic partnership with the partner that you're playing with. The game description only says to play it with your current partner, and there's plenty of queer and queer adjacent theory about the oddness of assuming that one's strongest or most important or primary relationships are a person's romantic ones. Here's what Brianna Shuttleworth says about the rules. So Pillow Talk explores communication, external stresses, and past romances with your current partner. The game takes place on a throw pillow placed between participants. They are to keep a form of physical contact with their partner for the duration of play. Most players will choose to hold each other's hands. The game is a zone capture strategy game where the two players compete for the most captured area on the pillow. Each player has the option to move or place a new piece on the pillow every turn, or to move and put an external block around the board, which can disrupt the other player. While the play is in progress, the players answer a set of questions about their relationship. Responding to the questions and creating dialogue around them is the only form of verbal communication that can happen until the end of the game. The game will end where there are no more moves possible to players. A winner is decided by a conversation between the two players. If no agreement can form within a reasonable time, then both players lose. So what's interesting about this game is the tension between the two main actions that the player is asked to perform, and what meaning each of those actions is being given by being placed in relation to each other. So playing a game that's framed as competitive with a partner while discussing the intimate details of that relationship is a juxtaposition with a lot of potential for tension. However, while the description says that players are meant to be performing during play, what they're meant to be performing during play, the goal is unstated. So this raises the question of what other potential goals the players could reach for instead. Will they commit to capturing as much territory as they can? If they aim only to win, what will happen with their intimate conversation? What impact could this have on their relationship? And what does it even mean to win in this context? Can winning in one sense mean losing in another? How does being actively reminded of their relationship affect the player's strategy and desire to capture territory? The answers to these questions are potentially quite different depending on every couple that plays. So what I especially want to highlight from this game is that juxtaposition of these two potentially very disparate mechanics and the ambiguity of the goal and rules. There's a lot of clear design potential in those design moves. So I mentioned a bit about Kara earlier. In Ritual of the Moon, players take on the role of a witch who's been exiled to the moon. In Time and Reparative Game Design, Queerness, Disability, and Affect, Stone explicitly points to queer theories of time, especially with respect to normative milestones, like ideas of when you're supposed to get married, what your family structure is supposed to look like, and other rhythms of living. So in this game, as a comet approaches the Earth, the witch has to decide whether to save the Earth or let it burn. And this is a game played for 5 minutes over the course of 28 days. So you play a little bit of it every day. Every day, the witch chooses how to use her power, and those accumulated acts determine the outcome of the game. Most of the game's assets were made with physical crafting techniques before being digitized. So there's a lot of like scanning, there's a lot of hand embroidery for the font that then became digitized. So yeah, the text was hand embroidered and wood burned, and many of the textures started as collages or other physical crafts with yarn, paper, clay, quilting, soldering, and other techniques. And as Ritual of the Moon parcels out its story across those 28 days, and the player learns more about the exiled witch, there are more complicated feelings that come into play than just preservation is good and destruction is bad. So Stone says the daily decision of protecting or destroying the Earth seems like an easy choice. Protecting and healing is always better than destruction, right? But something that's been reaffirmed over the political landscape of 2016 and 2017 is that some things need to be destroyed. We need to wipe some things out and sweep away their ashes before we can have the space for something else. When playing, I discovered that part of my experience with the game's durational aspect was that my connection really wavered and changed depending on the day. So there were days when I felt completely disconnected from a care for a world that I couldn't communicate with, that had exiled me for unfair reasons. And on other days, I could call to mind lots of wonderful things about the world and the people who lived there. So it was this tension between why save a world that I had been rejected from for being myself, and what did I owe the people who lived there? So that meant interrogating my own beliefs around restorative justice, about structural inequalities, and about what it means to try and fix or remediate broken institutions that often seem monolithic and in many ways unchangeable. So what I want to highlight here is the notion of queer time. So if the status quo of straight lives typically operates along very specific timelines and milestones, like getting married in your 20s and having kids soon after, and deviation from those timelines is considered abnormal, what can our lives look like when we pay attention to different rhythms instead, if only for a little while? What does deviation look like? What could our priorities be? Maybe also marriage or kids, but maybe not, or maybe on our own timelines. And how do these typical timelines tie into normative ideas around work and play? And what about the disruption to those timelines, the delays that many younger folks seem to be experiencing these days as we try to create some stability for ourselves? So in my own practice, I also employ these and other strategies. This is a game called Rustle Your Leaves to Me Softly that I made with D. Swingifer, and it asks players to form a fairly thirsty relationship with a live plant that's been turned into an alternative controller. So players caress the plant, and in exchange, the plant whispers sweet, poetic, romantic, and thirsty ASMR nothings to them. It asks players to think about what a plant might desire. What might it be like to try and please a living being that we can't usually communicate with or know the mind of, but that now, in this fiction, people are being asked to listen to and respond physically to? It's a game that makes a lot of people blush. Another example, I skipped the slide. So in the truly terrific traveling troubleshooter, again, D. Swingifer and I ask players to think about the value of emotional labor by performing it for each other and putting a price on it. So it deals with a kind of wandering figure who stands outside of the usual social configurations of an individual place, kind of like a wandering fortune teller or a traveling salesperson. And aesthetically, it makes physical that idea of radical softness that I talked about with Toto Winsworth. So a hard shell on the outside, the suitcase with a soft textile innard, these innards once you open the suitcase. And in a world that asks you to be hard and grow thick skin, this game's interface reveals its soft underbelly to you. So this other game, Traces, which is a doctoral project, is an interactive experience that asks players to take on the role of a transgender time traveler from another time and place who has come back to 2019 to collect the traces of other travelers who've come before them. It's usually played alongside its companion LARP, Act Normal, which asks players to take on the role of denizens from the good, bad old days of 2019. So there's RFID technology embedded in these sculptures, and these are distributed along a path through a space that's animated by the LARPers of Act Normal. And players are asked to stealthily collect every trace that they can find in the form of written and audio logs that tell vignette stories about the experiences of trans people and time travelers in North America in 2019. So this is a very personal project for me and a pretty vulnerable one. It addresses my feelings of both alienation and hope as a transgender person. Through the act of being stealthy and feeling observed and being questioned about what they're doing, players wind up experiencing in some very small way what it's like to, say, be a trans person in a public bathroom at an airport, or someone who's trying to go about their day without being bothered. It metaphrizes something about trans experiences while also telling stories about transgender people. Oh, and then we've got Strangers on the Net. So this is a game that I made with the Soft Chaos team. It's a live action online game that's played entirely over a chat service called Discord. And players are asked to take on the role of teenagers in 1999 who love roleplay as their favorite characters from a specific fandom. Think Buffy the Vampire Slayer or Sailor Moon or Pokemon, something with an ensemble cast, and chatting with their friends. So as they hang out and chat together, there's a fair bit of teenage gossip and drama alongside the flirting and role-playing. The game asks players to think about who they were as a teen, whether or not they grew up on the internet in the late 90s, and how their views and identity has changed over time. So the game's rules help players reflect on how we enact identity. Before they play, players are asked a series of questions to help curate the experience for them. And the game defaults to queerness and character design if players do not specify that they wish for a straight relationship, as opposed to the other way around. And this is a move to center queerness and flip the script a bit on the heteronormativity of most games. This is a new project the Fool's Fairy Tale. So here's a last quick example. Using 19th century fairy tale imagery from Virginia Sterrett, which is like a romantic Art Nouveau artist, and the landscapes of Ferdinand Hodler, the Fool's Fairy Tale, which is part of an upcoming anthology called Cartomancy, gives the players the choice to tell a version of a fairy tale that either subverts the status quo or affirms it as they play through the story of Princess Avery, who's supposed to ascend the throne, but has questions about what a monarch is for. I guess that's like pretty topical, right, with the Jubilee. The mechanics are not fully transparent. So the switch in the interface invites players to change allegiances, but the consequences of that and how the whole interface functions, how many endings there are and how to get to them is a bit opaque. So players can choose to discover and replay at their own pace, but they're not really invited to. Changing the status quo and uncovering the game's secrets has some friction to it. You have to work for it. So to sum up, here's a roundup of the design patterns in queer game design that I've talked about today. So radical softness and wholesome games with an edge, resistance to the status quo, which manifests in many ways, including alternate futures and questions about the present, non-humans, animals, and monstrosity. So since historically and even now, queer people's humanity is put into question, it's no wonder that we would relate to non-humans. We often use simple, accessible tools like Twine. The games are often low budget by necessity, but you know, if people gave us a budget, I think they would be pretty impressed to see what queer designers can do. Strange juxtapositions of unusual subject matter and unusual mechanics that make visible what we couldn't see before about structures and relationships around us. Challenging best practices in game design, playing with ambiguous win conditions, dealing with themes of queer time and queer futures, metaphorizing queer feelings and experiences, reflecting on changing identities over time and how we enact and explore identity, and centering queerness and flipping the script on heteronormativity. And of course, those are just some of the design patterns that you'll find out. I am looking forward to what questions you have, if there is time.
In designing a game, and I know that this answer is going to have a variety of answers, so I'm not expecting this is it. But in the game design, are you thinking of obviously expressing yourself in a queer design paradigm, but in terms of an audience, are you trying to attract people with similar circumstances, or are you trying to attract people who are different, who may not be queer, but who may feel similarly about society, feel similarly about a heteronormative world that they don't fit into for different reasons?
So that is a very good question, and it is one that I ran into with this game, because I thought I was designing it to commiserate with other trans people, but then it turned out that like most of the players wound up being cis, and also I was talking a lot more about, like, in the end, like trans suffering than trans joy, or that's the way that it came across. And I'll always remember like what one of my trans playtesters said to me, which is like, Jess, I think it's really important that people know that like trans lives are like not miserable because we're transgender, but because of like the way transgender people are treated, like the way that things are around them. So yeah, I think like sometimes audience can come afterwards, or it's not what you thought at first, which I think is like true of like a lot of practices. It does depend on the project. So you're right that like it absolutely depends. I try to make things that are approachable, but I also personally try not to like be palatable for the sake of being palatable, like toning things down or yeah.
Segment especially for the game designed for as a platform like this school. How is it to create a safe environment for queer folks?
So I think like part of it's not something that you can find without knowing what you're getting into. Like, so it is like there's an invitation only kind of situation. Part of what we do is we use a bunch of safety mechanics. I think the most important ones here are something called like X-carding, which is there are certain games that have to be addressed in the game and will be addressed every time. So we let players know that ahead of time. We ask them to tell us about like their comfort levels ahead of time. But then on the day of, we're like, these topics will be addressed in the game, but we can go slow on them if there's a problem. And what we do if people want us to go slow for those topics, because they will come up, is we have them react with a little turtle image, go slow. And then there's also optional topics in the game. And what we do is we go through a list and players can add to that list by sending us a message live as we play. That's like, you know, X card, I'm excited to explore this, or again, turtle, like approach with caution. Like, yes to this, but be careful around it. It's definitely a game that like attracts a queer audience, I think, on some level. The safety mechanics are very important, and the debriefing afterwards to like take care of any residual feelings, because we are asking people to like behave as people might have like in the 90s on the internet. Interestingly, we found that people are way more likely to want to dig deep down and play like close to the vest to like deal with like topics that directly affect them. And like, so what that means is like that you don't necessarily have like someone who doesn't have like experiences of transness dealing with like transphobia. Like that's not what they're interested in dealing with. They're interested in dealing with stuff that like they have maybe residual feelings about, is what we notice. Yeah, lots of safety mechanics and lots of opportunities to like change the course of play.
I think as well with both questions. I want to talk a little bit more about when you play testing and then what the testing for great audiences. But then if we get non-queer audiences, and what's the comparison that you get that in terms of feedback, in terms of the themes, and also the user experience during the game?
So I would say that, again, it depends on the project, but when I was doing playtesting for my dissertation work, for example, like it was mostly non-queer people, even for the games that dealt with queer themes. Like, I guess people who, how to put this? I guess who exhibit allying behaviors, like who like were like okay with queerness or wanted to explore those topics, even if they didn't consider themselves queer. But like, yeah, I guess like the response is usually like more careful and polite, I would say, from like from a non-queer audience, whereas queer people are like better able to give me feedback about the problems with the game around like, yeah, like what I'm centering, like, you know, like joy versus misery, for example.